What's up? DMD coming at ya. So today is an interesting day because we're going to take a Quad Cortex and actually go through the EFX loop and Seymour Duncan Power Stage 200 and see which one is better. First, we're actually going to take an actual capture, get it as close as we can to the actual amp. And then we're actually going to go through and take the Seymour Duncan Power Stage and the EFX loop and see which one is actually better. Let's give it a shot. Alright, so what I have here is I already have everything set up to hook up into the Quad Cortex so we can do an actual capture. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do this capture. I have the amp set up the way that I like it personally, and we're going to see how it sounds compared to what it actually sounds like. So let's go ahead and do the capture. I'm going to go ahead and see what it sounds like with the preamp. Just gnarly. Alright, so let's go ahead and do this one. Space sounds. So it's gone through, did the sanity check. It's training the Quad Cortex now. As long as it gets through the sanity check with the levels and everything, then we're good. Oh, looks like we're done. Okay, so between the Quad Cortex and in our reference, all right, sounds like the Quad Cortex has a little more thump to it for this capture. Now it's been the other way before. So let's see. Reference. All right. Quad Cortex. Almost sounds like there's a lot more depth to the Quad Cortex capture. I can't say that all the time for all of the Quad Cortex captures, but for this particular one, it does sound that way. So I'm curious to see how it's actually going to sound between these two. Let's go ahead and save it. Alright, so I got this all hooked up to where I have a Delisle input selector that's going through both the Quad Cortex and the actual amp. So both of these are going through this same speaker cabinet through to help with the Delisle amp selector. So whenever I select one, we're actually going through the tube amp. Now, whenever I select two, we're actually going through the Quad Cortex. So let's actually see what we got going here. First, let's see what the tube sounds like. Alright, so let's go over to the Seymour Duncan. Alright, so we need to bring this up. So this is the same capture we just did. And this is also actually where all of the settings are at noon here. So let's go ahead and switch between those two. This one being the tube amp. This one being the Quad Cortex. Tube amp. Quad Cortex. Tube amp. Quad Cortex. Okay, so straight off the bat, there's that digital blanket that all these things have. I mean, it's all right. It still needs tweaking. So what I would do is actually take this Seymour Duncan, and I'm going to get it as close as I can to the actual tube sound that I can with this. Obviously, it needs to have a little more presence, cut back the mids a little bit, and let's see if we can get the same kind of tone out of this. So, all right, so here's the tube amp. A lot more highs, a lot more presence. So let's give it a shot. This is the Quad Cortex. There we go. Bringing up the presence definitely helped. Okay, let's go back. Sounds like there's a little bit of highs in there. All right. Let's bring the highs up a little bit. All right, let's bring the highs back down there, actually. Let's actually bring the mids down on the Quad Cortex. That's pretty close there. There's just a liveliness about the tube amps. There's something when you play a tube amp that just comes alive. Whenever you play anything digital across the board, I don't think they've actually really gotten to that point yet, to where you can say, yes, it is exactly a tube amp. You get the feel, you got the punch, you got the power to it. But it's so close. With the Quad Cortex, I've had an EFX too, and it's close. It's the closest thing that I've heard. I've not tried the EFX 3 or anything like that, so that's still up for debate too. But from my point of view, it is super close, and the Quad Cortex, out of anything I've ever tried, has come closest to an actual tube and feel. Now, when you're playing live, I don't see any problem with that. If you start pumping it loud, it's going to be brutal. It's going to be clear. That's the thing about digital. It is clearer to a certain degree. Going from digital to a solid state, of course, you're not going to have that big openness like a tube amp would have. And when you crank up a tube, it just gets full and it just sounds so much wider. That's the best way I could describe it. And where a digital, especially with the solid state, just has that linear sound to it. So with that Quad Cortex sound, I'm pretty happy with that. All right. So just to take a look here, what I did is I dropped the mids a little bit. Actually, the treble is about noon, and the presence is actually brought up. So that's what I found with this amp, and it may differ from amp to amp. Let's actually go ahead and test the 4-cable method into an actual amp and compare that to the Seymour Duncan. So we're gonna A and B what it sounds like through the actual tube and the actual Seymour Duncan. So now what we have is the Quad Cortex going to the effects loop of the actual amp, and also I have another input, you could say, that is going to the actual Seymour Duncan. So what I'm gonna do is I have it set up so I can switch between the two, one being the tube amp, two being the Quad Cortex. So let's go ahead and see with the settings of what we captured before, what we were happy with on the Seymour Duncan, and compare that to what it sounds like on the effects loop. So let's see what we got. So right now we're going through the Quad Cortex. All right, so now we're going to switch it over to the effects loop. All right, so it sounds like the effects loop just has that more, it sounds a little more hollow, but it's closer to a tube amp feel, personally. And now I haven't touched anything with the EQ. I have messed with the volume a little bit. I will point out that whenever you do the effects loop, the volume has gone down on the actual amp. So I did have to bring that up. So let's just do a quick comparison between them. Man, just through the effects loop, it just gives it that much more power and punch. Now, I don't have it set up to where I can really turn it up loud, and that may differ if you do it that way and then compare them. So this is, you know, at inside a house kind of level. From my ear, it just sounds like it's better with a tube amp through the effects loop, just to give it that tube feel, but it sounds great through it actually. Quad Cortex. Tube amp. Now, mind you, I think that it's coloring it twice because we captured the actual power amp and preamp into the Quad Cortex. Now we're pushing it back through the effects loop, so the power amp is being colored twice in this instance. So yeah, it's probably not the most effective way of comparing it, but still, I still have that tube amp feel with the effects loop. So let's go ahead and talk about my thoughts on this. How'd y'all feel about that? You know, for me, it seems like the Quad Cortex through the effects loop is probably the best sound if you want that tube sound. Now, if you actually go through the Seymour Duncan, it gives it that digital blanket that anybody that is a tube guy, it just doesn't do it for them. And I get that. Now, in applications where you're actually sending it through the PA, it probably would sound really good through, you know, that feel going through a PA, you know, and that's when you put an IR on top of that. So yes, I would go with that through the PA from the Quad Cortex using an IR through the PA. For personally, if I wanted as close to a tube amp sound, I'd probably go through the effects loop of the actual amp. And now all the effects loops are different. There are some good ones, there's some bad ones. I can't tell you if the Jet Cities is good. If it's designed by Soldano, I am gearing towards that it is actually a good effects loop. So I do particularly like the Quad Cortex going through the effects loop of the amp and the amp power tubes pushing through, even though it is coloring it twice. So take what you will from this. Will I say to go ahead and use the Seymour Duncan Power Stage instead of it? I don't know. It kind of depends on whether you like the portability of the whole thing. It really depends on what you need in your situation. So for me personally, I would use the effects loop of an actual amp because I want to hear the actual sound and the tube feel. It is really close with the actual Seymour Duncan and just having a flat response and going through the cab. And I'm happy with it. You know, like if that was my only choice, I would totally do that. And if I wanted to just kind of like have just the least amount of stuff, yes. Yeah, go ahead and get yourself a Seymour Duncan Power Stage 200 and run it. For me, I would love to push the Quad Cortex through the effects loop, and then I have all the options of all the kind of captures that I have on the amp or have on the actual Quad Cortex. For portability wise, Seymour Duncan for sure, because what you're doing is for live situations, you're just monitoring for yourself. You know, it's a preference of, do you really want that tube sound? If you do want that tube sound, go ahead and use the effects loop of an actual tube amp. I suggest that full-heartedly. But I think this is a question of what you want it to sound like behind you. Now, the Blue Guitar Amp 1, that is something that I am actually looking into forward to picking up. And I will do another video on top of that to go through that effects loop and see if it actually produces the same feel that I'm looking for. So then it can be a totally portable situation. Until then, DMD. So if you guys like that, go to my Quad Cortex Cloud. You can get the capture and play it through your own stuff. DMD QC. Check it out.